There is a town in Illinois you cannot drive to from Illinois. To reach it, you leave the state. You cross into Missouri, you follow a road down the west bank, and then you cross a small bridge over what looks like a creek. There is a sign on that bridge. It says, "You are entering Illinois." Behind you is Missouri. Ahead of you is Illinois. And the Mississippi River, the border between them, is 2 miles east, on the wrong side of everything. The town has an Illinois area code and a Missouri zip code. 9 people lived there at the last full count. It was not built that way. It was the first capital of the state of Illinois. And then one night in April of 1881, the river left. Nobody moved the town. Nobody moved the border. The river moved. Here is the part that should bother you. What happened there was not an accident, and it was not the last time. It was the river doing the one thing it has always done, on a schedule older than the country. Every levee, every dam, every line on every map since has been an argument with something that does not argue back. The Mississippi has a memory, and it is longer than ours. Every so often, it goes back to check what we have built in its way. 20. Kaskaskia, Illinois, the capital on the wrong bank. In 1809, Kaskaskia was the capital of the Illinois Territory. By 1818, it was the capital of the state. French Jesuits founded it in 1703, and it sat on the east bank of the Mississippi, where Illinois has always been. The trouble started upstream, and it started with wood. Steamboats burned it, railroads burned it, crews stripped timber off the banks for decades to feed them. Take the trees off a riverbank, and you take away the thing holding the bank together. In April of 1881, the Mississippi came up hard, breached a narrow neck of land, and shoved itself sideways into the channel of the Kaskaskia River. Geologists call this an avulsion, a river abandoning its bed and seizing a new one all at once, rather than wandering there over centuries. When the water dropped, the town was on the west bank. The river ran 2 miles to the east of it. The state line did not move. Legally, the boundary stayed exactly where the water used to be. So Kaskaskia is still Illinois. It is the only piece of Illinois west of the Mississippi, reachable only through Missouri, over a bridge across the old Dead Channel. That channel is a bayou now, dry most of the year, and it fills when the river runs high, as if the water is checking whether the old bed is still there. The floods kept coming. 1927, 1973, 1993. Each one took a little more. A town that once held somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 people was down to 9 at the 2000 census. What gets me about Kaskaskia is the sign. There is a highway marker on that bridge reading Illinois State Line. It is telling the truth. It is also standing over a creek in the middle of nowhere, pointing at a border the river stopped respecting 140 years ago. 19. Napoleon, Arkansas, the town Mark Twain came back to find. 250 miles downstream, where the Arkansas River empties into the Mississippi, there was a town called Napoleon. For about 20 years, from the late 1830s until the Civil War, Napoleon was going somewhere. It was the seat of Desha County. It had a United States Marine Hospital. It sat at a confluence, and in the age of the steamboat, a confluence was an intersection of everything moving through the middle of the continent. People talked about Napoleon the way people had talked about St. Louis a generation earlier. Then, in 1863, the US Navy dug a channel. The town sat behind a protective bend in the river, and Confederate gunners were using that bend for ambushes. So the Navy cut straight through the neck of it, bypassing the bend and giving the river a shorter path. It was a tactical decision. It worked. It also handed the Mississippi a brand new steeper route aimed directly at Napoleon Point. The river took it. The new channel began eating the point immediately. Buildings went into the water. Streets went into the water. By 1882, Napoleon, Arkansas had not declined and had not been abandoned. It had ceased to exist. Mark Twain went looking for it. He had known the town as a river pilot before the war, and when he came back down the Mississippi 20 years later, he found open water where it had stood. He wrote about the strangeness of watching the river roll between empty shores directly over a place he remembered as a busy, self-satisfied town, a county seat, a hospital town, a town with a courthouse and a reputation and daily fights. A town, he wrote, that was simply gone. Locals say that when the river drops low enough, ruins still show on the sandbars out at the confluence. Brick and foundation stone surfacing for a few weeks, then gone again. 18. The meander belt, the river's actual footprint. Here is the thing about the line on your map. Geologists have mapped what they call the meander belt of the lower Mississippi, the total width of ground the river has occupied at one point or another over the last 10,000 years, not where it flows, where it has flowed. In parts of the lower valley, that belt is up to 125 miles wide. Sit with that. The blue line on the map is a few thousand feet across. The river's actual territory, the full range of ground it considers its own, is in places wider than some states. Everything inside that belt is former channel. Towns built on what looks like solid, sensible, high ground are sitting in the middle of a bed the river used before and has not forgotten. You can read it from the air, and once you know what you're looking at, you cannot stop seeing it. Long curved scars in the farmland, oxbow lakes, perfect crescents of standing water sitting in the middle of soybean fields, miles from the river, which are not lakes at all but severed bends, pieces of the Mississippi that were cut off when the channel straightened itself and left them behind. Field boundaries and county roads bend around shapes that no longer exist because the survey followed a bank that has since moved on. Some of those crescents still have towns on them. A settlement that was founded as a river port on the main channel with a landing and a warehouse and a reason to exist can now sit on a dead pond a dozen miles inland, not because the town moved, but because one night the river cut across the neck of its bend and took 4 miles off its own journey. The ground remembers all of it. That is the part we build on. The channel you learned in school is not the river. It is a snapshot of the river, taken during the few centuries we happened to be standing here watching, and the river has not agreed to hold still for the photograph. 17. Apprentice, Mississippi, the courthouse that surfaced. Bolivar County, Mississippi, a river port and county seat, thriving before the Civil War, gone under by the 1870s. Same story as Napoleon, war, a cut channel, then erosion doing the rest. What makes Apprentice different is what happened in 1954. The river shifted again, the water dropped, and part of the old brick courthouse came back up. Hunters found it. The story goes that at first all anyone could see was a chimney standing above the surface. It made national news, largely because most people had forgotten there was ever a town there to drown. For a short season, people came out with shovels and sifted through delta mud, pulling up champagne bottles and whiskey barrels and pieces of ordinary life from a place that had stopped existing 80 years earlier. Then the water came back and covered it, and it is said that Apprentice has not been seen since. I want to flag that this last part is the softest thing in this video. The courthouse and the 1954 exposure are on the record. Everything after that is what the Delta tells about itself. But the shape of it is right, and the shape is what matters. The river does not destroy these places so much as file them away. Because up to this point, everything you have heard was the river taking dirt. What comes next is the river taking things that were supposed to be permanent in a different way. 16. The border that stayed behind. When Congress drew these states, it used the river because using the river seemed obvious. Water is visible. Water is unambiguous. You can stand on a bank and point at it. The problem is that a legal boundary is a promise to hold still, and a river cannot make that promise. Courts eventually had to build an entire body of law around this. There is a doctrine covering slow change. When a river shifts gradually, grain by grain, the boundary shifts with it, and land quietly changes states. And there is a separate doctrine covering sudden change. When a river jumps its channel all at once, the boundary stays where it was. The ground moves, the line does not. That is the rule that stranded Kaskaskia. The 1881 flood was sudden, so the border stayed in the dead channel, and a piece of Illinois ended up on the Missouri side permanently. It is not a one-off. Up and down the lower river, there are pockets of one state marooned inside another, farms whose taxes and school districts and police response depend on where a channel was during some flood a century ago. There are places where the practical border and the legal border are miles apart, and everyone involved simply lives with it. We wrote our map in water, and then we were surprised when the ink moved. 15. The winter the river ran backward. Between December of 1811 and February of 1812, along a fault system near New Madrid, Missouri, the ground came apart 3 separate times. These are the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of the eastern United States. They rang the church bells hundreds of miles away. They opened fissures in the ground. Riverboat crews described the water boiling up as if in a cauldron, and sand blows erupting through the surface, throwing up material that had been buried for ages. And for a period of hours, the Mississippi River flowed backward. Not as a metaphor, the riverbed itself was warped, uplift in one place, subsidence in another, and the water responded the only way water can. Boats were carried upstream. Temporary waterfalls formed where the bed had buckled, then vanished as the river ground them away. One flatboat master tied up above New Madrid was woken in the night by a crash and found his boats had been carried more than a mile upriver by a wave coming up the channel. Passengers on the water believed the world was ending. Given what they could see, that was not an unreasonable conclusion. The fault is still there. It is still active. It is still considered capable of a major event. Most of the people living on top of it have no idea it exists. 14. Realfoot, the forest that is still standing underwater. Here is what those earthquakes left behind. In northwest Tennessee, the ground in one basin dropped somewhere between 5 and nearly 20 feet. It did not slide or slump. It simply went down, and water came in over the top of it. What had been a bottomland forest became a lake, about 23 square miles of it, averaging only 5 feet deep. The hardwoods that had been growing there drowned where they stood. They could not tolerate being underwater and they died. But they did not fall down because there was nothing to knock them over. So the bottom of Realfoot Lake is a forest. Standing trunks, root systems locked together in the mud, an entire drowned woodland preserved in place because the water arrived faster than the trees could rot. This is not folklore. Around a century after the earthquakes, a geologist photographed the lower end of the lake, showing the trunks of the trees killed when the land went under. That photograph sits in the United States Geological Survey's records today. Bald cypress still grow around the edges. Cypress can handle standing water, so the living trees and the dead ones share the same lake. One species that adapted to what happened, and one that was simply caught by it. You can take a boat out there. On a still morning in shallow water, In the right light, you are floating over the tops of trees that were on dry land, the last time anyone alive had a word for that place. 13. The lake somebody tried to own. Realfoot has a second history that almost nobody tells. After the lake formed, the families around it did what you would expect. They fished it. They hunted the waterfowl that came in off the flyway. For most of the 19th century, that was simply how people there fed themselves. The lake was new, it was unclaimed, and it was treated as common ground. Then a company acquired the claim to it, and in 1908, the Tennessee Supreme Court held that private ownership was possible. That decision meant fees. It meant restrictions on access. It meant that a lake created out of nothing by an earthquake, which had fed local families for 4 generations, could be closed to them. What followed was a genuine, violent local conflict, the kind that gets called a Knight Rider episode in the histories and is remembered very differently by the people whose families were there. It ended in state intervention, and eventually the lake became a state park and a wildlife refuge, which is what it is today. I bring it up because of what it says about this river. The Mississippi made that lake in a single winter by accident out of a forest. Within a century, people were killing each other over who was allowed to stand in it. The river takes ground, then it hands us a new piece of ground, and we do the rest. The paperwork could not hold this river. Neither, as it turns out, could anything else. Because the next thing we tried was dynamite, and we did not use it on the river. 12. Caernarvon, 1927, the public execution. The spring of 1927 produced the worst river flood in American history. Water covered 27,000 square miles across 7 states. The Mississippi ran up to 80 miles wide in places. More than 140 levee breaches. Hundreds of thousands of people displaced. As the crest came down toward New Orleans, the city panicked. Bankers and business leaders went to the governor with a proposal. Blow a hole in the levee downstream of the city. Give the water somewhere to go before it reaches us. The water will drain through the parishes below, and New Orleans will be spared. The people who lived in those parishes objected. They were told it was happening anyway. On April 29, 1927, engineers began blasting the levee at Caernarvon, about 13 miles below the city. Over the following days, they used 39 tons of dynamite. The crevasse they opened was releasing 250,000 cubic feet of water every second into St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes. Reporters came from around the country to watch. Photographs of the blast show earth thrown into the sky in a column. One local judge, standing with the press as it went off, told them plainly what they were looking at. He said they had just witnessed the public execution of his parish. Nearly 10,000 people were displaced. These were largely French and Spanish families, trappers and fishermen, working an economy built on fur and water. They were promised compensation. Claims filed came to more than $35 million. What was actually paid out was about $2.9 million, and the majority of that went to a single land and fur company, not to the families. 11. The part that makes it worse. The blast was unnecessary. The day after Caernarvon was opened, levees failed upstream on the west bank. That water went out through the Atchafalaya basin toward the Gulf on its own, and the pressure on New Orleans dropped without anyone doing anything. Engineers had said this might happen. Some of them said it before the dynamite was set. The river was going to relieve itself, because a river in flood always does. It finds the lowest, shortest way out, and it does not need permission. New Orleans was never in the danger the city believed it was in. 2 parishes were destroyed to prevent a flood that was not coming. Some residents did not accept the evacuation. There were men who armed themselves and patrolled the levee at Poydras in the days before the blast, refusing to leave, and shots were fired more than once. There were rumors in the city that people from below might come up and sabotage New Orleans' own levees in retaliation. Rumors serious enough that the city organized levee patrols and called in the National Guard. That is how this went. Neighbors on a river, armed, watching each other's earthworks, because everyone understood that on the Mississippi, protecting yourself and drowning somebody else are frequently the same act. 10. The levee arms race, which brings us to the mechanism underneath all of it. A levee does not remove water, it removes the water's ability to spread out. Floodwater that would have covered 100,000 acres of bottomland to a depth of 2 feet instead stays in the channel, and the channel is not that big, so the river goes up instead of out. Which means every levee makes the river more dangerous for everyone downstream of it. Which means the only rational response to your neighbor's levee is a taller levee. Which is exactly what happened for a century, up and down both banks. The measurable result is that the river stage at Natchez, how high the water sits in an ordinary year, has risen roughly 10 feet since the early 1970s. Not because there is more rain, because there is less room. We removed the floodplain from the flood and the water had to go somewhere, and it went up. Every community that protected itself made the next community's problem worse, and the system as a whole got taller and tighter and less forgiving with every improvement. So there is a certain logic to what came next. If the river cannot be persuaded and cannot be walled off, then the only remaining option is to hold it in place by force at the single point where it is most likely to leave. 9. The shortcut the river wants. Around 300 miles up from the Gulf, the Mississippi passes within reach of another river, the Atchafalaya. The Atchafalaya is a distributary. It carries off part of the Mississippi's flow and runs its own way south. And it has an enormous advantage over the main channel. It reaches the Gulf in roughly half the distance down a steeper slope. Water does not have preferences, but it does have physics. Given a shorter, steeper path, a river will take it. Not might, will. Rivers on flat, coastal plains change course this way constantly. The whole of southern Louisiana is built out of old Mississippi deltas that were abandoned when the river found somewhere better to be. The Army Corps measured the drift. In 1850, less than 10% of the combined flow at that latitude was going down the Atchafalaya. By 1950, it was around 30%. In 1953, the Corps ran the numbers forward and reached a conclusion. If nothing was done, the Mississippi would abandon its channel and switch to the Atchafalaya by about 1990. That is not a flood forecast. That is a forecast that the port of New Orleans, the port of Baton Rouge, and the industrial corridor between them would be left sitting on a shrinking side channel, while the actual Mississippi River delivered itself to the Gulf 100 miles west near Morgan City. 8. Old river control. So we built something to stop it. Completed in 1963 in a side channel called Old River, the Old River control structure exists for one purpose: to hold the split between the two rivers at a fixed ratio and prevent the Mississippi from changing course. That is worth saying slowly. This is not flood control. This is not navigation. This structure exists to prevent a continental river from doing the thing that continental rivers do. Its entire job is to make sure the Mississippi stays where we found it. The ratio it enforces is roughly 70-30. 70% of the combined flow continues down the Mississippi past Baton Rouge and New Orleans. 30% is released into the Atchafalaya. That split was not chosen because it is natural or stable. It was chosen because it was the split that existed when the structure was built, and freezing it there was the only way to stop the drift. Physically, it is a wall of gates. The original low-sill structure runs over 500 feet long, with 11 gates that can be raised and lowered to meter the flow, and a companion overbank structure beside it, built on dry ground more than 3,000 feet long to handle water in extreme events. Every day, engineers there take measurements and decide how far open each gate should be. Every day, the answer has to be right. The river is not being held back by the concrete so much as by a continuous, unbroken sequence of correct decisions stretching back 60 years. For its first decade, it was never seriously tested. No major flood came. The Corps was confident to the point of publishing language about having harnessed the river, straightened it, regularized it, shackled it. And then came 1973, the year we nearly lost it. Heavy rain saturated the lower valley through the fall and winter of 1972. Then in March of 1973, enormous rain fell across the Missouri and upper Mississippi watersheds, on top of a heavy northern snowpack that was already melting. All of it arrived at Old River at once. The structure went into a regime it had never seen. Water poured through at rates approaching the design limits. And then something began happening that nobody could observe, because it was happening under the water. Divers went down after the flood, and what they found was that the river had been scouring out the riverbed beneath the concrete. Exploratory drilling went in through the structure itself. There was a cavern under it. The foundation had been losing its footing while the flood was running, and nobody standing on it had known. It held, barely and partly by luck. If loose barges had come down and lodged against the front of it during the peak, the head of water behind it would have built with nothing anyone could do. The low-sill structure survived, but it was permanently damaged. It can now carry only about 60% of the flow it was designed for. That is why there is now an auxiliary structure beside it, and a hydroelectric plant that doubles as a third control point. Hundreds of millions of dollars of additional concrete, built because the original nearly went in 1973. Remember the meander belt, the 125 miles of ground the river has used before? Old River Control exists because of that belt. It is the single point where we have decided the river's history is not allowed to repeat. 6. What failure would mean. If Old River Control ever goes, it does not go slowly. The Mississippi does not need years to find the Atchafalaya. It needs weeks. The gradient is already there, the channel is already there, and the only thing standing between the river and the shorter route is a structure whose foundation the river has already been under once. Downstream, Baton Rouge and New Orleans would be left on a channel with a fraction of its former flow, too little to flush it, too little to maintain the depth that ocean-going ships require, and open to salt water pushing up from the Gulf into the intakes that supply drinking water for about 1 million people. Meanwhile, a new delta would begin building near Morgan City, on top of a town that is not designed to be the mouth of the Mississippi River. John McPhee wrote about this place and about the engineers who worked there in a piece called Atchafalaya, published in The New Yorker in February of 1987, and later in a book. His framing has never been improved on. The Corps is not fighting a river. It is fighting the second law of thermodynamics. The people who run that structure are not confused about this. They know the river is going to win eventually. Their job is to make eventually not be today. That is the arrangement. One structure, one ratio, held by maintenance and vigilance and money, against a gradient that has been patient for 10,000 years. And that is what it takes to keep the river in the channel. Nothing at all keeps the water in the river. 5. The river does not obey the rules. Ask anyone whose job is pulling people out of the Mississippi, and you will hear a version of the same sentence. One veteran recovery diver, working under the bridge at Algiers in New Orleans, put it as directly as it can be put. He called the river a beast. He said it does not obey a lot of the rules other bodies of water do. He said it after being defeated 7 separate times on one search. The reasons are structural. The channel is deep at its deepest point, near Algiers, roughly 200 feet straight down, a canyon 2/3 the height of the Statue of Liberty, running underneath a major American city. Water rounding a hard bend accelerates outward and downward and grinds the bed, and where the bed is being ground, the flow is doing things that do not resemble a current so much as a machine. Add debris that entered the water in Minnesota. Add barge and ship traffic, whose wake can wash a person off a bank without warning. Add banks that collapse under their own weight when they are saturated. Add sandbars that look like beaches and are unstable enough to give way underfoot. The people who work this river professionally do not describe it as dangerous. They describe it as unsurvivable without equipment. And they say the probability of taking it on one-on-one is that you lose. 4. The children at Algiers. In April of 2022, near the Crescent City Connection Bridge in New Orleans, a 14-year-old girl slipped on a piling at the water's edge and went in. Her 8-year-old sister went in after her. So did her 15-year-old boyfriend. All 3 were taken by the current within seconds of each other. The recovery operation ran for days. Divers from multiple parishes, an underwater rover, sonar, work confined to a narrow band near the bank because that was all the river would allow anyone to search. 2 of the 3 were eventually recovered. The 8-year-old was not. Her body has never been found. There is a white stone marker on the levee there now, put up by the families, overlooking the water. A year after it happened, there were still no signs and no barriers on that stretch. Federal legislation had been signed instructing the Army Corps to review safety threats along the river and consider protective measures. On the ground at the spot, nothing had changed. You could walk down to the same pilings on the same wet stone, and there was nothing to tell you what the water in front of you actually was. 3. Why the river keeps them. There is a reason recovery on this river is so often unsuccessful, and it is worth understanding because it is the same physics that runs everything else in this video. The lower Mississippi carries enormous volume at speed. In flood, it has moved past New Orleans at over 1 million cubic feet per second. Even on an ordinary day, the discharge is on the order of 160 semi-truck trailers of water passing a fixed point every second. Anything that enters that flow is not in a place. It is in a process. It moves continuously in the dark, under a load of sediment, among snags and pilings and scour holes and vortices that form and dissolve around every obstruction on the bed. Searchers can define an area. The river does not keep anything inside a defined area. That is the whole problem. Twain understood the essential thing about this river before any of the engineering existed. He watched it erase a county seat he had personally known, and what struck him was not the violence of it. It was the completeness, not damaged, not ruined, gone, with open water rolling over the top and no sign that anything had been there at all. 2. Every dam is temporary. Put the timescales next to each other. The rock beneath this valley is ancient beyond useful comparison. The fault system under New Madrid is the scar of a rift that started tearing North America apart around 500 million years ago and then stopped, leaving a weakness that the river eventually found and followed. The channel we call the Mississippi is roughly 10,000 years old. meltwater from the end of the last ice age, finding its way south through a continent that was still dripping. The levee system is about a century and a half old. Old river control was finished in 1963. Compress all of that into a single day. The bedrock forms at midnight. The river appears in the last fraction of the final second. Every lock, levee, flood wall, and control structure we have ever built fits inside a span of time too small to see on that clock. And within that flicker, the river stage at Natchez went up 10 feet. 2 parishes were dynamited. A state capital ended up on the wrong bank. And the control structure that was supposed to settle the question permanently nearly went out from under itself in its first real test. We are not managing this river. We are negotiating with it, briefly and expensively, and the terms are not ours to set. 1. The river has no channel. Here is the thing underneath everything you have heard. In its natural state, the Mississippi River does not have a fixed course. It has a range. A river of this size on a floodplain this flat is a system in permanent motion. It builds up its own bed with sediment until the bed is higher than the surrounding land, and at that point, it is running along a ridge of its own making, and any breach in the side becomes a shorter way down. Then it leaves. It abandons the old channel, takes the new one, and starts the process over. The lower Mississippi has done this repeatedly. Every one of those old courses is still down there. The whole 125-mile meander belt, a fan of abandoned beds and filled-in channels, each one the main stem of the river for a while, which means the Mississippi on your map is not a feature of the landscape. It is a position held for the moment. The Army Corps of Engineers is not maintaining a river. It is maintaining one selection out of a set of possible rivers, against the constant pressure of all the others. The levees are not walls. They are proposals. And every few decades, the water rises and evaluates them with the indifference of something that has been doing this since before there were people to object. The river remembers every channel it has ever used. Periodically, it goes back to look. There is a bridge in southern Illinois that crosses a creek. The sign on it says Illinois State Line, and it is not wrong. And it is standing over a bayou that was the main channel of the Mississippi River until one night in April of 1881, when the water decided it preferred the other side. Nobody moved the town. Nobody moved the border. Kaskaskia already found out what the rest of the valley is still arguing about. The one that stays with me is Caernarvon. Not the dynamite, the arithmetic afterward. 35 million in claims, 2.9 million paid, most of it to a company. 10,000 people flooded out to stop a flood that was already stopping itself. For scale, on an ordinary day, this river pushes enough water past New Orleans every second to fill 160 semi-truck trailers, and it drains about 41% of the continental United States. Every one of these stories is that force meeting a decision somebody made on paper. Which of these unsettled you most? And if the river took a town near you, there are more of them than anyone has counted. Put the name in the comments. Somebody in your county still knows where it was.